Hey, RetconRaider here. Today's video is once again dedicated to mildly nuclear. Thanks for your continued support, Nuke. That said, let's get started. Now, it's been a while, but today I thought we'd take a second look at The Briefing Number 4. This ebook was released back in mid-April and included 6 new short stories set in the Phoenix Point universe. We've already talked about 3 of these new stories, so today we'll be taking a belated look at the rest of the new stories included in this compilation. As usual, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we'll start with something simple. The short one-page introduction entitled To the Non-Believers. Much like the introductions to the previous 3 briefings, this one was written to create a loose narrative framework around the rest of the stories in the collection. In this case, the introduction is supposedly penned by a member of the Disciples of Anu. They write about how those who reject or dehumanize the infected do so out of a blind nostalgia which prevents them from recognizing how the world has changed. The writer argues that those people are fixated on the impossible task of somehow returning the world to the way it once was, rather than adapting to accept the world as it now is. The introduction concludes by vaguely alluding to how humanity survived the original outbreak of the Pandora virus millions of years ago, and how learning from that event would allow mankind to survive this one as well. That rolls rather nicely into the first of the 2 major stories that we'll be analyzing today, Before the Waters of Life, by Jonas Kairatsis. Much like the introduction, this story is also written from the perspective of a member of the Disciples of Anu, but in this case, it goes into more detail about the circumstances surrounding their decision to join the cult. The narrator explains how they lived in a small independent haven for 10 long years, before finally reaching an existential crisis. They concluded that if the only purpose of life was to survive, then life was ultimately meaningless, so they left the safety of their haven in search of some greater purpose. This was a decision that almost proved fatal, as the narrator ran afoul of mutants on the first night of their pilgrimage. This strange creature, only described as a multi-legged monstrosity, somehow paralyzed an entire group of scavengers with its voice, before methodically slaughtering them all. Although this was a harrowing experience, the narrator stressed how it had taught them a valuable lesson. These creatures were far too powerful for humanity to oppose, at least in their current state, which meant that the human race would need to adapt if they wanted to survive. The narrator then described how they arrived at another independent haven, one which is on the cusp of joining the new Jericho faction. In the meantime, the haven was still being approached by agents of Sanhedrion and the Disciples of Anu, so the narrator took this opportunity to learn more about all 3 factions. While they did admire certain things about both New Jericho and Sanhedrion, the narrator ultimately concluded that neither faction was ready for the new world they found themselves in. Instead, New Jericho was obsessed with somehow restoring an idealized version of the past, while Sanhedrion was instead obsessed with some imaginary utopian future. The narrator felt that the 2 factions were unable or perhaps just unwilling to face the harsh realities of the present. When the narrator met with the disciples, however, they were instantly intrigued. The cult's representative, later identified as Taxiarch Nergal, patiently answered all of the narrator's questions. He explained that the disciples believed the human soul was perfect, but that the human body needed to evolve. The mist was not simply a threat that needed to be accommodated or overcome, it was an opportunity. Yes, the disciples did believe it was a divine punishment, but one that would ultimately leave humanity even stronger once it had been endured. While the cult's strange methods frightened outsiders, Nergal assured the narrator that they were all founded on ancient traditions that had helped humanity survive through similar trials in the past. The narrator found these explanations to be quite compelling, but Nergal warned them that joining the disciples required commitment. The ancient rites and rituals that the cult observed were there for a reason, and failing to properly adhere to those traditions would lead to the same sort of hubris and infighting that had resulted in humanity's downfall in the first place. The narrator ultimately decided to travel to a nearby disciple haven, where they were converted in one of the cult's chambers of baptism. Although the narrator admits that this process was messy and unpleasant, it also rebuilt them into a new, better type of humanity, one that was better suited for the harsh new world that they found themselves living in. The story concludes with the revelation that the narrator's whole story was part of a recruitment pitch. The narrator warns the reader that the world has changed and it will never go back to the way it used to be. The end of days is nearly upon us, and the human race must learn to adapt, or it will die. Despite this doomsaying, the story concludes on a slightly more uplifting note. When it feels like you are drowning, remember, there is hope. Now, this story is fascinating. It's somewhat similar to the introduction, but it provides a much more in-depth look at the mindset of a member of the Disciples of Anu. It stresses the core differences between each of the game's three main factions, how New Jericho seeks to live in the past, Sanhedrion seeks to live in the future, and the Disciples seek to live in the present. It succeeds at painting the cult in a much more sympathetic light, not necessarily justifying the way that they do things, but at least explaining why they feel that their behavior is justified. Like the other factions, their ultimate goal is to help save the human race, but in a way that will redefine our species in the process. While their methods certainly seem extreme, it's interesting to note how the story stresses that these methods are rooted in ancient tradition. Since we know that the Order of Anu claimed to date back to ancient Mesopotamia, it's strongly implied that these traditions are built on prehistorical encounters with the Pandora virus, such as the one described in the Tomb of the Phoenix. Of course, the story also serves to give us some valuable new details about the Disciples of Anu as well. For example, it gives us our first real glimpse of the cult's indoctrination process, something that they immediately revisit in the next story. We first heard about the Waters of Life back in the Book of the Exalted, in the original Disciples of Anu teaser on the Phoenix Point website, and again in the Acts of Taxiarch Nergal. Between the Chambers of Baptism and the name of the story, Before the Waters of Life, it's once again implied to be an integral part of the cult's indoctrination process. It's also interesting to note that this story gives us our first real look at Taxiarch Nergal, a character who will almost certainly end up appearing in the final game. He was originally described in the Acts of Taxiarch Nergal back in the briefing number 2, and I previously speculated that he might be a survivor of the precursor race, literally millions of years old thanks to the effects of the Pandora virus. However, the stories collected in this briefing seem to thoroughly debunk my original theory, instead implying that Taxiarch Nergal is simply an infected human. The narrator's description of Nergal, as an older but extremely tough-looking man, certainly seems to reinforce this. We know that the Exalted personally transformed Nergal to help protect the first of the Disciples, and thanks to the last Patriarch, we now know that the Disciples weren't actually formed until the 2030s. While the events described in the Acts of Taxiarch Nergal do seem to run parallel to the events surrounding the fall of the precursor race, they could just as easily be attributed to the events surrounding World War III. Of course, it's also important to remember that this whole story is told from the perspective of a devout member of the cult, so we have to take all of these details with a grain of salt. Since this is ultimately intended to be a recruitment spiel, the narrator takes every opportunity to paint the faction in glowing terms, while simultaneously glossing over some of the cult's more controversial aspects. This, of course, brings us to another story, where those more controversial aspects are on full display. Let's talk about Cult People, by Alan Stroud. Now this is one of the rare cases where one of the stories acts as a direct sequel to a previously released story. In this case, Cult People is a direct sequel to Colony, one of the stories included in the briefing number 2. It takes place at the Anunnaki Temple an unspecified number of years after the previous story, and focuses on Jess Miller, a character who also served as the narrator in Colony. By the time that Cult People takes place, Jess is known as Jess Sib Miller, a fully indoctrinated member of the Disciples of Anu. The story begins with her leading a small group consisting of 3 other disciples, including Sarah Sib Hewitt, Thomas Sib Walter, and Daniel Sib Tremaine. While patrolling the ruins of the Goldstone Industrial Complex near Anunnaki Temple, the group encountered 2 uninfected children, Lila and Zachary. Lila explained that their convoy had been attacked and that everyone else had been captured by mutants. The prisoners were being carried to the ocean, and she was hoping that the disciples could help rescue them. Sympathizing with Lila's plight, Jess quickly agreed to help her, despite Daniel's objections. The group set off in pursuit of the mutant warband, and Jess soon found herself developing a bond with Lila. Seeing much of herself in the young girl, Jess began reminiscing about the events leading up to the present. She thought back to her early life in the crumbling city of Pine Bluff in the days before the Second Mist, where she was first infected with the Pandora virus. She remembered waking up 4 days later, healthy but with a hole in her memory, only to find out that almost everyone else who had contracted the disease had died. She then thought back on the events of Colony, how she had first joined the convoy headed towards Anunnaki Temple. She remembered how she had first met Daniel Tremaine and the undercover priest, Peter Ackler-Lill, and how Daniel had tried to convince her to run away. In the end, she had of course stayed with the convoy. Jess then recounted the events that took place between the two stories, how she had volunteered to become a full member of the cult, and how Daniel had been forced to do it against his will. Back in the present, the group caught up with the mutant warband along an old road. Once they realized that there were too many mutants to face head-on, they decided to split up, with Jess and Lila heading back to Goldstone to fetch a vehicle while the rest of the group kept an eye on the mutants. Jess and Lila loaded explosive materials onto an old van, then lit it on fire and drove it into the mutants while Daniel and the others distracted the warband from the tree line. Jess was badly injured in the process, breaking several bones, but the majority of the prisoners were successfully rescued. The disciples and the other survivors quickly regrouped in the woods, where Jess decided that they would split back up into 3 separate groups. 2 of the groups would consist of 1 disciple and a small number of survivors, while the third group, consisting of Sarah and Thomas, would remain behind to discourage their pursuers. When some of the survivors protested, stating that they didn't want to go to Anunnaki, Jess gave them permission to leave, a decision that enraged Daniel. Jess insisted on leading one of the 2 groups, but regretted her decision soon afterwards. Finding herself to be so badly injured that she could barely walk, let alone protect the survivors, she found herself overwhelmed when they were attacked soon afterwards. The last thing she remembered before passing out was the sight of Lila trying to save the other survivors. Jess woke up later that day, kneeling outside of Anunnaki with another hole in her memory. Met by Sarah, she was informed that everyone else, including Daniel and his group of survivors, had arrived at the temple earlier in the day. Unfortunately, the survivors who had accompanied Jess, including Lila, were nowhere to be found. This is another rather fascinating story, and one which paints a much grimmer picture of the disciples of Anu. For example, I previously speculated that Daniel, who was featured back in Colony, had been killed or forcibly captured by the disciples when he tried to leave the convoy. This story confirms that not only was he captured, but he was then also forcibly indoctrinated into the cult against his will. His violent temper was described as the result of his conflicted nature, as what was left of his mind fought against what he had now become. This puts a particularly sinister spin on what the undercover priest, Peter Ackler-Lill, said back in Colony. We experiment on everyone, including ourselves, because humanity has to survive. There is no other way. This is made even more chilling by the exchange between Daniel and Jess when Jess permitted some of the survivors to leave. Daniel made it clear that he thought Jess was only helping the survivors so that they could bring them all back to the temple, and he also made it clear that Jess's decision to let some of them go would result in her being punished. Given that we know the disciples are willing to take people by force and experiment on everyone, it's not hard to imagine what the cult might have wanted with the survivors. Jess even went so far as to warn them that the priest would get to decide the fate of anyone who followed her back to the temple. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the indoctrination process itself. It's been hinted at in the past, but this story includes numerous new details in the form of a first-hand account. According to Jess, this process involved deliberately injecting the Pandora virus into the aspiring cultist. This would trigger a new wave of mutations, including linking the cultist to the hive mind or collective consciousness of the virus itself. As the cultists transformed, they would become overwhelmed by this link, desperately seeking to escape to the ocean. Jess described it as an uncontrollable yearning to rejoin all of her mutated friends and family, as well as a new father who would teach her the ways of a world that her mind and body had forgotten. During this time, the aspiring cultists would be kept restrained, literally mutilating themselves in their efforts to escape. Jess described it as being reduced to a bloody ruin of what she had once been, scarred and twisted as the virus remade her mind and body. Eventually, weakened by starvation and injury, the aspiring cultists would be taken to a rock pool. The viral influence would somehow be subdued through a combination of chanting and thick, muddy water, after which a bulging chunk of infected flesh would be cut from the back of their neck. This process appeared to sever their connection to the viral hive mind, and in its place, they would instead hear the voice of their new leader, the Exalted. This is particularly interesting because The Interrogation, another story by Alan Stroud, suggested that the virus controls people through a growth it creates on their brainstem. The indoctrination process described in Cult People seems to imply that removing this growth not only removes the viral influence, but also allows the Exalted to exert a much greater influence in its place. Although not as drastic as the mutation seen in most other Pandora virus mutants, this process still changes the victim in numerous ways. The infected cultist becomes significantly stronger and tougher than before, and appears to gain some degree of enhanced healing or regeneration. It also appears to create some form of mental link between the infected cultists, allowing them to sense each other's location and general state of mind. However, it's also important to note that this mental link appears to allow for some degree of control or undue influence over individual members of the cult. As previously mentioned, Daniel seems to be a clear example of this, given his drastic change in behavior after being forcibly indoctrinated. It's likely comparable to the slow transformation seen in Fragments of Knowing, after Paul Hatchell was similarly infected by the Order of Anu. This is further complicated by the cult's strict hierarchy, which is reinforced with some form of ritual mutilation or blood sacrifice. In Cult People, it was shown that symbols of authority are carved directly into a cultist's flesh. These symbols grant leadership among a cultist's peers for as long as the mark persists, and transferring this authority, even temporarily, appears to require additional mutilation. While it's certainly possible that these markings are simply ritualistic, it seems likely that there's more to it than that. It's possible that these symbols served an actual tangible function, perhaps reinforced by the mental link shared between the cultists. We also know for a fact that some members of the cult have the ability to actively control certain types of mutants. Given that all indoctrinated members of the cult are also mutants, is it really that far-fetched to imagine that they could be actively influenced or controlled as well? This could explain what happened to Jess near the end of the story. We know that towards the end of the story, Jess was acting against the interests of the cult, despite how she kept trying to justify her decisions to both herself and her fellow cultists. Given her growing attachment to Lila, it seems very unlikely that she would have willingly turned the young girl over to the priests of Anu. Knowing this, is it possible that someone higher in the hierarchy took direct control of her? We have no idea what happened after she blacked out, but she later described how she had a hole in her memory. This not only seems to be a callback to the hole in her memory from when she was first infected by the Pandora virus, but it also sounds strikingly similar to how the Order of Anu manipulated Paul Hatchell in Fragments of Knowing. Of course, I might just be overthinking things. It's entirely possible that Lila and the other survivors simply carried Jess back to the temple after she passed out, leaving before the other cultists could see them. While they didn't know where the temple was, it's certainly possible that they simply guessed based on the direction that Jess had been traveling in before she passed out. Then again, it's equally possible that the survivors suffered a much more sinister fate. After all, Peter Ackler-Lill, the priest of Anu from Colony, clearly showed that the cult is perfectly willing to take people by force. Perhaps someone a bit higher up in the hierarchy influenced or controlled Jess just long enough to make sure that the survivors were successfully delivered, then purged any memories of the incident from her mind. On that cheery note, I think it's time to wrap up our analysis of the briefing number 4. I could certainly do a great deal of additional speculation about the nature of the Disciples, the Exalted, and the Pandora virus in general, but I think we'll save that for a future video. For now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the Facebook page, the YouTube page, the subreddit, the official Discord channel, or the original crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. Links are in the description.